Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. When Mnangagwa got into power on the cocktail of the 2017 military coup, he was cocksure his Zimbabwe is open for business, would open the floodgate for investors to come in and revive Zimbabwe's economy. And we will all live happily ever after. As we know, it did not happen. Zimbabwe is open for business was meant to send a clear message to the investors that Zimbabwe had changed since this takeover. But as we know, investors are a shrewd lot. They were not going to be so easily conned. They could see with their own eyes that the 2017 military coup was nothing more than musical chairs where Mugabe and a few of those around him were booted out, and Mnangagwa and his cronies took over. But Zimbabwe was just as much a pariah state after the coup as it was before the coup. They could see that. And this is why they did not pour in as Mnangagwa had expected. Since then, Mnangagwa has changed tack. He has tried to claim that Zimbabwe nevayo. In other words, Zimbabwe will be developed by its own people. But in a country where so many of the professionals were forced out by the regime as economic and or political refugees, the question was asked, if so many professionals have left the country, and some people put it up to 70% plus, who is building the country then? And the truth is now clear. The so-called Zimbabwe nevayo has too failed to deliver economic prosperity. And ever since the 2023 election, Mnangagwa has indulged in what most people can only term as madness. Corruption was bad during Mugabe's time, but since then, it has become something else. And Mnangagwa has used some of that ill-got wealth. Instead of developing the country, improving the country's infrastructure, he has poured it on buying votes and buying loyalty to those around him. Billions of dollars were used last year alone in buying cars and other luxuries for the few. For no other reason other than to buy popularity. But when you look at the basic infrastructure like hospitals, roads, etc., you realize that this is going nowhere. And naturally, of course, the people are realizing it, and they're getting even more restless. But Zanu PF has done one thing. It has always relied on using brute force to retain power. Before independence, it was confined to the rural areas. And now the regime is extending it to urban centers. Here is an urban Zanu PF supporter in her own right who is complaining about how the regime has turned on its own supporters. Sorry, we seem to be having some technical difficulties in playing the video.
Pese patinoenda kumusangano kuti izvoni ukaona uchirota uchipwanyira munhu paakavaka mukautengese gumbezi iroro ndozvandoziva kuti baba vangu vaED vakataura izvozvo tiri kuchivhu patakaenda kumusangano handiti musangano kwese tinoenda ende vazhinji vanozoziva kuti vhoti yavo muno munenge mazara maZanu PF chete hakuna mumwe munhu asiri weZanu PF makadzi zvotori nawo eZanu PF handiti munhu wese ari mumwe ane kadzi rake reZanu PF marigari atinawo usamuona kubvira musi wakazvakaitika ndakanga ndakangopfeka baba vangu kuti nyange vanotora mapikicha kana vanotora chii kana vanorekodha vachindoona ndakapfeka chii handivasiye handitika asi tikutema kuti baba unewo zvotaitirwa izvi panapa patiri panapa patara matsotsi anopfuura vana vedu vari kuenda kuchikoro tetakavanyoresa paruwa primary saka izvi tinodziwana kupe mari inini kwendee ndichitoshanda mukatumbu handitika ndichishanda paprivate school saka private school yacho yapwanya handisina basa handina kwandichaona kuti mari vana vangu mumwe wacho uyo ane 8 years ari papo handiti ndiye mudiki anga ari paruwa primary saka ndotangira kupi
zvinoona kuti vanhu vakakuri kuita muri kuita sei muri kuenda kuti
nditokoripa baba ini panaka sena handina kana kukuenda handina kana mari handide handipinde kana mubhawu handina kukwanisa tora kana mari yekuti ndotora kupi saka chitemo chandinotoisawo kuna baba vangu kuti baba honaiwo zvataitirwa muri.
The tragedy here is that she and a number of her fellow dwellers in Rua. Rua, for those of you who are not familiar, is just one of those satellite areas that have sprung up around Harare. And this has happened in many other towns and cities in Zimbabwe. In the past, before independence, blacks could own property. They would be given title deeds to the house, even those houses, the matchbox houses in the high density suburbs. At least they would have title deeds to those houses. And as some of the blacks became more affluent, they could afford to buy a bigger piece of land, get title deeds to that, and build an even bigger house. The white regime stubbornly refused to give title deeds to rural people. It insisted that the land in the rural areas should be communally owned. That is why it's called communal areas. Even when it was clear that giving those people title deeds to the land would significantly improve the land itself, because when the people have the confidence that they own the land, they could afford to build a decent homestead for themselves, away from the usual structure of the mud hut. But Ian Smith did not want to do that. His argument was very simple. If you allow the blacks economic empowerment, the next thing they would want is political empowerment. And Ian Smith was not prepared for that. Ironically, after independence, Mugabe decided he was going to retain that policy for the same political reasons. As much as before independence, the rural people, at least you owned the mud hut and the little ground round it. Not even a headman would dare try to push you out of your house, out of your mud hut. But since independence, these Zanu PF thugs have become more arrogant. To force you out of your hut, they'll come and erect a fence right through the house, the hut. That is where we are now. What is happening in Rua is actually an extension of Zanu PF extending its reach to urban centers. Zanu PF has kept the rural people poor and dependent on the regime for selfish political reasons. It's not a secret. Any Zanu PF leader and anyone there with half a brain will tell you that is exactly what has been happening here. Here is Margaret Dongo explaining that idea.
They have wrong priorities, especially the current government. How can you go and build an airport which services a few people, and the majority are the elite and the so-called investors? Look at the rural. I made you come to interview me because I wanted you to have the experience of the roads that we are using. If we go today to our hospital there, you feel pity with that's a hospital in a rural area. If we go to our clinic, you feel pity. We have no piped water here. Do you know the reason why the rural people vote for Zanu PF? One, they're intimidated. Two, the policy is that the rural people should remain poor and subservient to the government. They should remain poor, because if they remain poor, they continue singing the song for their master. This is why these people have been impoverished. It's for a reason. Because at the moment, if you economic empower these people, they'll go out of hand. Zanu PF will never have control over them.
So the reality is when Mnangagwa failed to deliver economic prosperity through Zanu, Zimbabwe is open for business, he tried to buy power, political favor. And that is becoming clear that it has failed because basic infrastructures like roads, hospitals, schools are in a sorry state. And Mnangagwa has finally resorted to using brute force to retain power at all costs. And we are now beginning to witness some of that brutality. What is happening in Rua is not a surprise. I think as the country's economy sinks deeper and deeper, we will see this regime resorting to more and more acts of violence. So this warning from Java is timely and to the point.
2026 igore rekungangurwa.
Kungangura what?
Igore rekusungwa.
Alright.
Ya vanhu vachasungwa.
Kusungwa izini kusungwa
Kutoiswa mujeri.
kusungwa nemwechina.
Hayo kutoiswa mujeri cha. Amajeri achazara.
Ko chini chetika. Nenye muso dzichaparwa ipapa beka nemuso nyango dzitakapara kudhara titakutyaka.
Zvese ingori wave yekusungwa. Vanhu vachangangurwa. Vanhu vachangangurwa maminister, mapoliticians, mabusiness people. Hakuna munhu asiri kungangurwa next day.
So if the truth be said, the Zanu PF supporters in Rua are experiencing the start of that wanton violence. The regime is in a panic, it's desperate to hang on to power, and it's going to do anything and everything it can to hang on to power at all costs. That is the tragedy of Zimbabwe. I think I would like to remind the people of Zimbabwe that as much as we saw this coming in the rural areas, because Zanu PF's denial or refusal to give the rural people title deeds to land is not new. We saw it happen before independence. And many believed that that was one of the key issues we were fighting to end. And yet when Zanu PF adopted the same policies, we all turned a blind eye. We never spoke about it. We let the rural people suffer. And we thought we were okay. And now the regime is moving to those in the urban centers. It's determined to retain its autocratic control, iron grip on power at all costs. And one way of making sure that it retains control is to make sure that people are poor, turn us all into poor and helpless serfs. They've done so already. Economically, many Zimbabweans were employed in mines, in industry, in all sorts of economic activities. Where are some of those companies now? 45 years of Zanu PF rule, many of them have closed. Up to 70% plus of Zimbabweans are now in the so-called informal sector. Kia. Anopota nehwakungwako segungu. And not content with that, the regime is moving in on the urban's right to own the piece of land on which their house is built. What is happening in Rua is the start of it. The regime is coming up with all manner of excuses to justify telling people that they don't own the property.